In the latest edition of Rewriting History, we saw Richard Petty take his second consecutive championship over Ned Jarrett in a close-fought battle. So today, we're going to take a look at the 1965 season and how it would have played out with a consistent points format. In 1965, we had 6 full-time drivers: Dick Hutcherson, Ned Jarrett, Bob Darrington, Cale Yarborough, Neil Castles, and G.C. Spencer. In the opening 11 races, only 2 full-time drivers won races. Ned Jarrett would win 3 races at Spartanburg, Weaverville, and Hillsboro, and Dick Hutcherson would win the race at Greenville. So after the opening 11 races, Ned Jarrett would lead the standings with a huge lead over Dick Hutcherson. Over the course of the next 11 races, Ned Jarrett would absolutely crush the rest of the opposition and would win 3 races at Hampton, Shelby, and Harris. And because of Ned Jarrett's dominance and just overall consistency, he now had a whopping 287-point lead over Dick Hutcherson. At race 23 in Nashville, Dick Hutcherson would take the win while Jarrett finished second, closing the gap to 272 points. At Birmingham, the roles would be reversed with Jarrett winning the race and Hutcherson finishing second, and the gap was reset to 287 points. At Hampton, Jarrett finished third and Hutcherson finished 8th, stretching the gap to 315 points. At Nashville, Hutcherson would win the race while Jarrett finished 13th, decreasing the gap to 264 points. At Myrtle Beach, Hutcherson would go back-to-back and win his second race in a row, while Jarrett finished second, and the gap would shrink to 254 points. At Valdosta, Hutcherson finished 12th, while Jarrett finished 13th, closing the gap to 241 points. At Daytona, Hutcherson finished 19th and Jarrett finished 20th, slightly decreasing the gap to 238 points. At Manassas, Hutcherson finished second and Jarrett finished third, but due to Jarrett leading laps, the gap would flatline to 238 points. At Old Bridge, Hutcherson finished second and Jarrett finished 5th, closing the gap to 223 points. At Islip, Hutcherson finished second and Jarrett finished third, shrinking the gap to 218 points. At Watkins Glen, Jarrett finished third and Hutcherson finished 12th, and after 33 races, Hutcherson was still hovering around that 250-point buffer and just couldn't seem to break through and convincingly beat Ned Jarrett. At Bristol, Jarrett won the race while Hutcherson finished second, and the gap grew to 276 points. At Nashville, Jarrett finished second while Hutcherson finished 15th, growing the gap to 328 points. At Shelby, Ned Jarrett would win the race while Hutcherson finished third, decreasing the gap to 343 points. At Weaverville, Jarrett finished second and Hutcherson finished third, increasing the gap to 353 points. At Maryville, Hutcherson would stop the bleeding with a win, while Jarrett finished 6th, and the gap would close to 323 points. At Spartanburg, Jarrett would fire back with a win of his own, and Hutcherson would finish 9th, and the gap was now 360 points. At Augusta, Hutcherson would win the race while Jarrett finished 3rd, slightly closing the gap to 345 points. At Columbia, Hutcherson finished 3rd while Jarrett finished 7th, closing the gap to 316 points. At Moyock, Hutcherson won the race while Jarrett finished 2nd, decreasing the gap to 301 points. At Beltsville, Jarrett would win the race while Hutcherson finished 12th, growing the gap to 359 points. At Winston-Salem, Hutcherson finished 2nd while Jarrett finished 3rd, and now with 11 races to go, the gap was a whopping 354 points. With this gap, all Ned Jarrett needed to do was finish 5th or better in every race, and he would walk away the champion. At Darlington, Ned Jarrett would get off to a great start, winning the Southern 500 while Hutcherson finished 19th, and the gap was now 433 points, and that threshold would move down to 8th. At Hickory, Jarrett finished 3rd and Hutcherson finished 15th. The gap grew to 475 points, and the threshold moved to 10th. At New Oxford, Hutcherson would finally have a good race and win, while Jarrett finished 4th, slightly closing the gap to 450 points, and the threshold was now 9th. At Manassas, Jarrett finished 2nd while Hutcherson did not participate, and the gap was now 630 points. At Richmond, Jarrett finished 19th and Hutcherson finished 25th, extending the gap to 648 points. At Martinsville, Jarrett finished 4th while Hutcherson finished 6th, and the gap was now 658 points. And this would be enough for Jarrett to lock up the championship 5 races early, and Ned Jarrett would make a statement and win the season finale and put an exclamation point on a near perfect season. So in 1965, Ned Jarrett would finally claim that first championship in our timeline after 3 runner-up points finishes in 1961 to Rex White, in 1963 and 1964, both to Richard Petty. And after all that, Ned Jarrett would finally win his first championship in dominating fashion over Dick Hutcherson. Well, that'll do it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week for 1966.